But before we do that,
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
the next beer.
I've been pre-sipping
This is
too.
their
Not a bad
La
boy.
Fiesta Mexican Ale. It is a light, crispy, easy drinking, and delicious. This one is a fan favorite, perfect for the warm weather. Try it with a fresh lime, which they did provide to us. Each one of us does have a lime. It is an ABV of 4.8. Gentlemen,
Cheers.
Cheers.
All right, drinking
Cheers.
already.
Yes, I'm going to spill this if I... thank you.
Great transition straight from Sodom and Gomorrah to here's a light, refreshing beer.
ooh, that is light refreshing
good.
too.
That is really good.
That is really
It is delicious.
And
Like,
that lime
Good
is
follow-up, too.
perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really nice. So, fun story.
I got to dip the line in.
My historic anecdote in biblical contextualism.
Ooh.
So, Sodom and Gomorrah. Did you know that that actually has nothing to do with homosexuality?
I've heard.
Like at all? So, we get that from the New Testament. So, if you go to the New Testament in the book of Jude, it actually references that sin, right? However, it references it in relation to the fallen angels. So if you go back and you read those two passages in context, according to Jude, those men actually knew that they were fallen angels. So it wasn't so much a sin of homosexuality, it was a sin of trying to crossbreed with divinity.
Ooh.
Yeah.
That's some slick stuff.
Yeah. So it's pretty interesting
Yeah.
once you start diving in. You can't really see it in the English very well. It's in the Greek because you have your male and female neuters, and so when you go through in the Greek, it relates back.
Yeah.
Yeah, female to female or male to. So it actually relates back to the fallen angels as you read it in Greek. It's very interesting.
Interesting.
Yeah.
To put a bow on that for the sake of listeners, and maybe for us too, but the sins that cry out to vengeance are murder, the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, whatever it is, oppression of the poor, and defrauding workers of their wages. So one of these things is not like the other.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. I actually learned that from Dr. Michael Heiser. That's who I learned that from.
Rest in peace.
Yeah, rest in peace. Yeah, God bless him. God bless his family. Fantastic contributor to biblical contextualism. Yeah, it's well, I will forever take the lessons and apply them to my life, especially in a lot of his interpretations, because his interpretations usually relate back to original language and culture, which is fantastic.
And so between like things we learned from Dr. Heiser, or like when we've had David Bennett on, like what we learned is like typically is that what the Bible actually says is far more interesting than the reductionist modern interpretation. Like that is much more interesting
Than what we
than
wanted
if it was
to say.
sodomy or gay stuff.
Yeah, yeah. It's there's so much more depth to it, and it relates better to the ancient world too, because they were less concerned. Let's face it, it was in-depth part of the ancient, like Greek culture, Mesopotamian culture, right? So it's very interesting to see that they're trying to crossbreed and create more things like demigods, right?
Yeah.
And they're like, well, this is my path to being like a demigod, right? Interbreeding with these angelic beings, because I remember in my ancient, context, what happens if we do this.
It's usually about power. Like if you're wondering about like what's someone's motive, ulterior motive here, it's probably about power. I've heard even too, like, a main character of the Old Testament that we don't often consider is like the land. Like most of like the marital relationships in the Old Testament come down to like who gets to what piece of land.
It's true.
Well, and... Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no, okay, that was all I got.
Just to maybe make a little connection there.
Please.
And I think this has created a lot of problems for us in Western society, but like that language that you have in the creation account of dominion over the earth, power over the earth. And I think this goes back to that kind of tension of how maybe we misunderstood. And if you go back to the sources, we interpret dominion through the empire model.
Yeah.
So it's, and in many ways, I think often you find, like almost the Christian God is based for a lot of people is Zeus, hating his enemies, violent, angry.
It emerged.
oversensitive, but to me, I think it's interesting to consider that the gospel really kind of redefines power.
Yeah.
One of my good friend that I mentioned from the Catholic Worker turned me on to another Protestant scholar or spiritual writer named Ched Myers. And he has this read of the Gospel of Mark, where he says Mark is actually indicating that the apostles are not very good disciples. That if you look at the Gospel of Mark, someone like Simon Peter's mother-in-law is actually the real model of discipleship. She has this healing encounter with Jesus, immediately enters into diaconia, to service, and she's there at the cross. The apostles, as we know in some of the scriptures, they're arguing about who gets to sit on Jesus' right hand. They understand power is control, domination in that hierarchical model. And, that notion of dominion over the earth, if you read it not through the empire model, which is largely what we have, where it's just an afterthought, it's here for us, it's all about us.
Yeah.
But as, the gospel where power is service, Jesus washes his disciples' feet. This is what it is to be great.
Yeah.
Then now all of a sudden dominion is taking care of it. It's a very different, leads to a very different place.
Yeah.
So
In Hebrew context, it actually leads more to, the interpretation leads more to stewardship rather than dominion.
yeah.
So we take it on the Western viewpoint. We're like, have cow, wool, slaughter. But but it's actually in the ancient Mesopotamian context. If you go back to the root words in Hebrew, it relates more to stewardship. So it's very interesting.
Yeah.
Dave, do you force your students to read your book?
No. I would probably get in trouble for that. Yeah. Well, I mean, there's, it's an honest reflection, but I also wouldn't feel right about it. But a lot of it is built on just what over years of teaching, my reflection and my grappling.
Yeah.
I've generally given up on the book, and I'm at great peace. It was a lesson in the positive, I think, Christian sense of failure, and I don't say that in a sad or depressed way, actually, but
You've given up on it in what sense?
just, I wrote it, I put it out there, and, I think one thing just in general that I kind of realized, maybe not in advance, is writing a book takes a lot of work.
Oh yeah.
And I did it, and I did it in a way such that I'm proud of. And even from the beginning, I never had any big expectations, but I hit a point where I'm like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to finish it. I actually had written it, and I'd given it to a coworker at the time. I was maybe 50 pages in, and I said, I was telling him about it. He said, "Oh, can I read it?" He's like, "This is great. You should keep working on it." And I'm like, "I'm going to do it." But equally, you need to put as much work into selling it. And I think I never had the desire to do it, because partially too, I don't think it's for everybody. And, I never felt right about telling someone, even it's kind of tied to, we talk about kind of that interreligious stuff. And it's like, I just want you to be happy where you're at and find meaning and truth. And I don't, it's not for me to tell. So, I think, so in that way, I never felt right about selling it.
I think, so you didn't want to be like Richard Rohr, ends up on Oprah, right?
Well, I mean, the truth of the matter is that was going to be my sales strategy, was to either end up on Ellen or Oprah, and it didn't work out, So,
You end up on Bible over Brews.
Well, I will say this, that
I have lots of copies if any of your listeners want free ones, though. Yeah, I'm happy to pass them out. Yeah.
my son, and I won't say his name, recently started reading it. I recommended it to him.
Oh.
And we could talk more about that later if you want. but especially dealing with something I think just as relevant and tied into social justice, with the younger generations dealing with anxiety and because of all the social justice issues, and seeing the enormity and the weight of the world for, people who I would say are like 19 and maybe lower 20s.
Yeah.
It's a very real thing, you
Yeah.
know, when they see so much of it all the time on media. Yeah, I mean, you can pick a social justice issue every day of your life and try to go, full throttle with it, but it's a lot. Mm-hmm. And so I think for some, they hit like this threshold, and all of a sudden they don't know what to do with it anymore, and boom,
Yeah.
like the spiritual side of things really kick in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the anxiety is it's such a hard reality for a lot of us. I think it's important really too to say,
Yeah.
I mean, I saw my doctor the other day. I was kind of dealing with a little. I had a while where I was seeing a counselor and thought I was in a pretty good place for a few years, and but I think, anyone who's struggling, you're not alone. Again, to kind of go back, I've heard they say of Jesus, showed love through, words of comfort to the afflicted, words of challenge to the comfortable, and presence. And I think, a lot of times, and this even kind of relates back to what you said, Keith, it is, like, I don't think, like, Jesus, we have much more of a fixation on, like, theology than Jesus seemed. I mean, I think probably what was in some ways most profound about Jesus was just that he was with people.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Present.
the I can't remember who wrote it, but the marginal Jew, that's the famous historical study. He was with those who were alone, who were hurting, and so, yeah, I mean, that was one part of it that I tried to be honest, and I don't always, and there's a certain uneasiness about it. And maybe I'm misunderstanding you, but, I
No,
think,
not at
like,
all.
because I know I've been helped by other people who've done the same for me, who've in their own ways kind of let me know I'm not alone, and again, religion bind together, how do we get back to right relationship? Because that's where well-being is. I think that's actually really at the core of one of our problems is a society. Again, at the service of power, division works.
Yeah.
But there is a cost, that's when that's our driving force, people are sacrificed.
Yeah.
And, so.
I'm hearing in there, like, focusing local, focusing on your space, on the people you interact with every day. Because I get anxious, too, about, like, there's so many injustices, and there seems like such little will to deal with the root cause, or even if I just think about the injustices just in our state, and I think about the political math and how those things will likely never even get close to addressed in my lifetime, no matter how hard I politic. But there's also, like, people right around me. There's people who are in groups that are ostracized. There's people who are, not being fed or not needing home or just need comforted. And there's opportunities every day for us to, like, just be nice to people.
Yeah.
Like, it can be that simple. Like, I've read, there recently was an article on a anti-social justice, nominally anti-social justice Catholic resource that was basically telling people to overthink what it means to be charitable. They were like, if you adopt the perception that being charitable means, like, being kind to people, like, you're doing it wrong and you are risking, God's displeasure. And it was like, it didn't really offer a solution. It just said, you have to think more like God, whatever that means. And, like, that's paralysis right there. Like, that's where I go, like, oh, should I really be nice to my gay neighbor because they this bishop said something? Like, that's where, like, you get, like, especially the scrupulous people, which is a whole other topic that maybe we should have an episode on. Hey, ding, 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 a reference to a future potential episode in a podcast.
Slow down.
Yeah.
The next one is a reviews episode.
That's right. We won't go there. But, where you get that person who's like, I have to follow every little law that's told to me by any religious authority, they will refrain from being just nice to people because of a perception that is condoning a lifestyle that supposedly their religion condemns. Yeah. And then you end up just kind of in your own shell. You don't have friends. You're not reaching out. You're not making a better community.
Yeah.
Whereas Jesus constantly took risks with people that were on the outskirts of society, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
Very true.
When I first became a technician, I was installing and troubleshooting in people's homes. One of the things that struck me, because let's face it, 20 years ago, if you were a Muslim, you were not looked kindly upon, right? Because I've been in my industry a long time. And one of the things that struck me right away is that whenever I did a trouble call for somebody that was of Islamic faith, they were very kind, very nice. I couldn't leave their house without getting some form of crackers and tea, and they were incredibly nice. And I was like, I think that we're definitely misjudging these people. They're not evil.
Right.
No doubt.
And it always blew me away just how kind they were. I was like, there's definitely a misconception when it comes to this.
When your evangelical president spouts out, well, if you're not with us, then you're with the enemy. That was very irresponsible. So.
Yeah, and that definitely that struck me in a chord that obviously echoes to this day, right? And that's that people of other faiths can be equally as congeal and nice and hospitable, and so. It's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing to be disappointed by.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's a good point. Yeah.
I've been a little disappointed with church ever since 2020, when I had what was literally the most spiritual experience of my life, that was probably surrounded by people of no faith at all or totally different faiths. Was in the middle of a Black Lives Matter protest, the protest for actually was also focused on Desmond Franklin, who was killed in a police altercation around the same time as George Floyd, maybe a few months before, kneeling down and praying in the middle of Pearl Road with a huge group of people blocking all lanes of traffic. And it was intensely spiritual. These were not people subject to what they call a woke mind virus, or trying to commit violence or whatever, or taking advantage of an opportunity. These were people crying out to God for their brothers to stop being slain in the streets.
For social justice.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I mean, if I can maybe go back to the beginning and try to connect it to that.
Please.
At the core of all of Christian social justice, Catholic social teaching, is kind of identifying a question, a sign of our times, and then trying to apply our faith, our ideals, our values, and asking where they point us, and I think you could call this really a discernment model, which, again, it starts with a question. We have to be detached to really be free. So to the extent I'm attached to my side, I don't have that freedom to ask, where does my faith and my ideals and my values point me?
Okay.
Like Catholic social teaching as a specific kind of tradition involves a certain set of, there's sometimes 7, sometimes 9, there's a debate about but there are themes that just continuously get reapplied.
Okay.
And
different values.
Yes. So like dignity of the person, preferential option for the poor and vulnerable, care for creation, rights and responsibilities. And there's 3 other ones, solidarity, dignity of work and workers. And it's kind of like, in this moment, what do these ideals have to say? And they're all scripturally rooted. So if you ever read a document of Catholic social teaching, you're going to see those themes. You're going to see scripture passages just responding to a moment, a place and time. And the obviously the first principle is dignity of the person / respect for life. And one of the things that I often bring up in my class, and it does initially make my students uncomfortable, but then I unpack it, is all lives don't matter. That is the reality of our world. We talked about immigration, and there was that image maybe a few years ago, perhaps you remember, of the child tucked into its parents' shirt, its dad's shirt, and both had drowned, and their lives didn't matter. Our perception of safety perhaps mattered. But, when you hear about people dying in factories in the developing world, there was 2 high-profile ones about a decade ago, I think in Bangladesh, and, one was close to 1,000, one was a couple hundred.
Yeah.
They didn't matter. Profit mattered.
Right.
Flint, Michigan, as I understand it, GM knew a year before the people of Flint, the mostly African-American people of Flint, that water was corrosive. What mattered in that moment, so I think, part of the challenge is, Catholic social teaching, it's kind of a corrective in that it's meant to be. And not that we always do it this way. Again, prophets, we need people to call us out and challenge us. But I think, it's tragic that people, responded to that movement as they did. But if you read Martin Luther King, you realize they did the exact same thing 50 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
And, and then again, and I just as one last point, I think this gets into another tension of our time with a lot of debates about history. Because you can't look at history, or I'm sorry, you can't look at, slavery, you can't look at segregation and deny that for much of our history, Black lives, or you could talk about indigenous lives, did not matter. Certainly not to the extent of other lives. And so, and again, I think perhaps why wouldn't we want to face that? Because if we acknowledge that in our history, then we have to not assume rightness, we have to hunger and thirst for it, which, as we talked about, is uncomfortable. And, we have to say, maybe, we need to change some things. And again, that's kind of really the core of justice, is that it really it says we need to change. And as humans, change is frightening because it's the unknown. The way things are is known. And if it's good for us, because of the confirmation bias, we naturally assume that it's good.
Yeah.
And I think that's where, again, I think, though, too, the gospel is a lot more disruptive than we realize, where the parables, they're disruptive. They're stories that are actually meant to make people uncomfortable. I mean, the cross, it's a scandal that it doesn't make us uncomfortable. Yeah. Because it's not, it's where we might end, if we call out the idols. Archbishop Romero said that. He said, wealth and the economy and military, those are the idols. He says, if you question them, they are like a high-tension cable. And he ended up, 100%. And he said, you will get burned. And he ended up burned, and he saw it coming. So, but people don't, people, that idea of change is very frightening. I'll bring up one last person that kind of is relevant. There was a Brazilian bishop named Dom Helder Camara. And again, I don't want to give, people this sense, you have your bishops that have been very justice-oriented, you have bishops who are very anti-justice. A lot of bishops were not on board with Romero. That's true. So I don't want to, I'm not but this is kind of the tradition I'm most aware of. But he has this famous line where he says, when I feed the hungry, they call me a saint. When I ask why they're hungry, they call me a communist. And it's just, in that term, as he is referencing it, has really no economic meaning. It's a term of demonization because people don't want to question whether there's something wrong with the world. Because if there's something wrong with the world, then it needs to change.
Yeah.
So we're very attached. Sorry, one last thing.
No, please.
There's one reading we used with my sophomores, actually my seniors, written by an anonymous interreligious group in apartheid South Africa. It's called the Kairos document. And the word Kairos, is God-appointed time. What is the call of this moment? And they said the call of this moment is to call out the way theology in South Africa, and it was Catholic and Protestant, was being used to justify oppression. Which, again, liberty to the oppressed. That's what Jesus called for. Theology used to justify oppression. But one of the things they point to in the document is what they call state theology, where really theology is at the service of the status quo. So the beginning, there's a great quote, and I haven't brought it out, but there's a great quote that they cite in the Kairos document where they bring up the preamble to the apartheid constitution. It's something like, in humble submission to Almighty God, who brought us to this land and gave us it as our own, and has wondrously delivered us from our enemies. And it's basically they're saying this reality of apartheid, which meant, I think at one point, 17% of the land could be owned by the 90% black South Africans, was God's will. And we were the last developed nation to not support apartheid. This was into the 80s. And it's just interesting. And right after it, they say, this God, the writers, after they quote this preamble, they say, is an idol. It is as mischievous, sinister, and evil as any of the gods, basically, in the scriptures. Because and to those people of the apartheid regime, they said, God loves us, all the stuff we say. But if you followed the theology all the way through, it ultimately was being used to promote the status quo. So that a real God, because often, interestingly, in a lot of justice-related theology, the issue that comes up a lot is idolatry. Again, we focus on idolatry as a sin of the other, but Jesus says you can't serve God and mammon. Yeah. It's mammon is wealth, the recognition, and again, so many in our country, trust wealth, trust profit. It will lead us. Do you know how many people were sacrificed to that God, that false sacred reality? Think about the tobacco industry.
Oh, yeah.
We have a history of human sacrifice, when we've treated wealth as a god,
Yeah, that's true.
But yeah, so the status quo often kind of becomes this reality that can't be questioned.
Yeah.
So.
No, and to touch on that a little bit, and this is going to hit a few people. I'm sorry, I apologize. to touch on that a little bit, I use almost all Samsung products. I'm going to bring it up because this actually has to do with my ideas of social justice.
You're so anti-Apple.
There's a reason. So, does anybody know? I have two major reasons I use Samsung. Does anybody know those two? No? Okay. So, number one, they are innovation. Okay, so they do things before anybody else. Yes, Google adopts it later, Apple adopts it later, but they're innovation centric. I love that. But number two is the bigger reason for me. So if you were to walk into Samsung's factory in Korea, they have a green cafe. They pay for everybody's college. They have parental. They have parental care. You have paid time off. And if you go to the Apple factory, there's nets around it to prevent suicide. That right there is kind of an idea. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's a real
actually,
thing.
I actually didn't realize this before. Like, so is Samsung's most of their final assembly is actually in Korea instead of China?
So yes. So
Okay.
they do have a spillover center, and the spillover center is over there. But their main factory is actually in Korea.
Oh,
So and they have all these beautiful things in place. Now, I haven't done enough research on their spillover center, but on their main center in Korea, you have all of these beautiful things in place to make sure that their employees are well taken care of. On the flip side of that, over in the Apple factory, they have to spend nights all week long in the factory to make sure they're up in time to get back on the assembly line. So Samsung's going out of their way to take care of their employees, at least the ones that live in their country.
and that Apple stuff's also outsourced to Foxconn to provide this
Yeah.
separation between the profit center and the suffering.
And that's one of my major reasons for buying Samsung products, is because I firmly believe that I like the way they treat their employees. So
Whenever you include as part of your benefit package suicide prevention nets, one does stop to ponder.
right.
Maybe that's all Apple needs.
A lot of what David you were talking about reminded me a lot of. I'm reading a book by Ibrahim Kendi called "Stamped from the Beginning," and it's a pretty exhaustive history of racism, especially specifically as it applies to America, told through like several different lenses of various, like, basically as he calls them, like the assimilationist voice at the time, like the person who tried to bridge the gap between like the racists and the anti-racists. And his kind of big thesis is that like racism or hate in general is like always downstream of self-service, of profit, of keeping the status quo. Like there's someone who has power, and then racist theories are created to justify that. And like kind of the clearest example from the beginning is like the word slave comes from Slav. A lot of the slaves in Western Europe from the beginning, it was, predominantly Slavic peoples. Later, it became African and Slavic peoples. At a certain point, the Slavic peoples fortified, and the Portuguese got really good at importing slaves from the east coast of Africa, or west coast of Africa. And so at that point, and all along this time, there's being new theories evolved of racism, of specific, like, this color is good, this color is bad, to justify the importation of slaves. Like at first it was good, and this is dating back to Aristotle, that the olive tone of the Mediterranean peoples was the ideal, and if you were too far north, you were too white, and if you were too far south, you were too black, and these caused corruption in humans. So, and then when it became, well, all the slaves are from Africa, now it just became white is good, black is bad, and we'll go to the point of developing theology. We'll develop theories that, if you import a black person to a white climate, that they'll become more white, at least in spirit, and so this is good for them. So all these elaborate justifications derive over time just from the basic, like, we can have power by having free labor wherever it comes from, and it happens to come from here, and then we'll make theories that supposedly bake this into the order of the universe.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. Man, this has been a fantastic talk, and unfortunately we can't hang out too much longer because they're about to close.
They're going to make us clean if we.
So, Dave, fantastic. And mind you, we want to support your book, and I've got one or two ideas afterwards. Because we want to help you market that book. It's a fantastic book, and I think it really drives some beautiful points forward that I think future generations are going to benefit from.
Yep.
So we want to make sure it's propagated and properly distributed and well known among the people. So where can people find the book, first off?
Last I checked, I think it was on Amazon, just as that's where it is. But
Fantastic.
I think
What's the title of the book?
I Am Not God.
I Am Not God.
Yeah.
I thought you were saying that for a minute, but that was the
No,
title.
that's what it's called.
Which is, yes, true.
There
You're
it
not
is.
God.
I got it.
Yeah, but can you answer my question?
I have a lot of good quotes in there. Yeah. There it is, right there. You can.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic book, great points. it's spoken very well in great humility. It's a fantastic
great.
book. Yeah.
Awesome.
So we want to make
Being
sure.
read in my house now.
Yeah.
Again.
Yeah. We want to make sure that that is definitely propagated and well known. And I have one or two ideas we'll go over later.
Okay.
And any last thoughts?
Yeah, well, just as a last thought, the same idea from two different traditions. So one is an Eastern, perhaps Buddhist tradition where someone observed, you're perfect the way you are and you could use some improvement. The other one, St. Ignatius, his anthropology, his understanding of humans was loved sinners. And I think, justice is hard. It's because, like, your example was so great about Samsung and, and Apple and, we contribute, in ways we're not even aware of to hurting, and, there are chocolate companies that still use slavery.
Yeah.
And again, partly this is the options we're presented with. The whole plastic industry, it's so hard to not just be a part of that. So again, justice is trying to say we need to kind of also recognize that the way the world is sometimes leads us, it kind of almost makes it hard for us not to hurt other people. But the reason I brought up those two quotes is I think, to hopefully balance it out where as hard as it is to think about this stuff, to say that, that we mess up is, like, I think sometimes we're just too sensitive. We talked about, kind of some LGBT stuff earlier, and, I always have said, like, when someone says, hey, if you call that broken tire gay, like, that hurts someone else. Now it's like, on one level I might think, wow, this is one more thing I have to think about. One more way the world's telling me I'm a terrible person. But I just think, could we maybe instead think of it as, this is one more opportunity for me to become more aware of how I can not add to the hurting in the world. Because I know I've got some things that I'm doing wrong and ways that I'm hurting. And so when you point it to me, it's not, oppressive, it's liberating. It's an opportunity to be a more loving person. Yeah. So, and we're all works in progress. I think in the end, all we can do is struggle and try to become more aware. But I just do want to. I think it's important to have that little asterisk and have that space that it's a given. None of us are perfect. Yeah. So. Maybe we don't have to get so defensive when someone invites us to consider whether there's some things that are wrong with the way we're doing things.
You're saying we have to consider others? Oh, my Lord. Keith?
I couldn't really say it much better than that. That was a great summary and conclusion. It reminded me of a point I had in my head kicking at the beginning that I didn't think about, that I'll just touch on briefly, which is that, like, for as much as, like, it can seem like addressing social justice issues is, like, disrupting a status quo that can be disadvantaged to people in power, like, or just, from anybody's perspective, like, one thing that occurred to me, especially in, like, all the things that happened in 2020 such, is that a lot of the core social justice issues that affect, racial, sexual, whatever minorities are often things, if they were addressed, would help, like, my kids, like, or just anybody. Like, when you think about issues with healthcare or our social or our criminal justice system, like, all those things, if you fix those things for folks who are suffering the most in those systems, everybody's boat would rise. So I'll leave it with that.
Yeah.
Good.
Gumby?
I'm thankful for tonight, Dave. I appreciate you. Thankful for you and all the work that you do for all the people you teach, and for being Alex's softball coach years ago, and
She was a star, so yeah.
and so there's nothing taboo over Brew, and let us not grow weary of doing good.
Yeah. Yeah. And thank you for all the work you do. I Am Not God is the book. Available on Amazon, and we're going to collaborate on this later.
Thank you, Goldhorn.
Yeah.
Yep,
Thanks
yep.
for having me, guys, too.
Thank you, Goldhorn. Goldhorn, you're
Thank you,
awesome.
Goldhorn.
Yeah. Great beer, fantastic food, fantastic time. My biggest regret is I couldn't eat tonight because I'm cutting weight. Biggest regret, because the food here, fantastic.
My biggest regret is I forgot to order before the kitchen closed because this discussion was so good.
And thank you for being both my sponsor and my kid's godfather.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Don't forget to hit us up on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, you name it. We're on it. Our next podcast coming up, we're going to be working on Bible Brews reviews for The Pope's Exorcist. Godspeed. Good night.
Peace. Thank you.